We're recording. Okay.
Okay, well, I'm with Luke Thompson. We're going to discuss, we think we know what we're going to discuss, but maybe it'll turn into something else. And if it does, I can't guarantee that I will rein the conversation in, because sometimes it's more interesting to let conversations go where they naturally go. But I have a fledgling podcast called Universalism Against the World, ironically enough. And I've never had a guest on as of yet. I've been doing a lot of solo episodes, which is just me talking to myself, basically, or me reading essentially audio essays. They're just not written, extemporizing them. I've been doing that a lot, but I've been meaning to have people on. Luke Thompson is definitely high on the list of people whom I would want to have on my podcast. He's not what you yourself don't have a platform per se or credentials, quote unquote, but like neither do I. And as far as I'm concerned, you just sort of look at the landscape of people who are interesting and then select the interesting ones, and it's more or less orthogonal to credentials. And specifically the agenda, if there is one, is to look at Luke's trajectory to his belief in universal salvation or reconciliation or Christian universalism, as a way of exploring, not only how these things happen on the personal level, but also the relationship, the theological interrelationships among various ideas. Because I think that universalism is an idea that connects with so many issues. I mean, every topic in theology does, but universalism is especially central. Yeah. So with that being said, I guess I would just go ahead and ask you, Luke, to introduce yourself if you want, and just like give a, start at wherever you think the beginning is. Start at sort of your baseline theology. And tell the story as you have, I think, done at least in parts or in pieces elsewhere. Tell the story of sort of where you started and where you are now, and sort of the logical transforms along the way.
Okay. So I was raised, I've said this before, religiously, kind of what I would call an evangelical mutt. I grew up in a really in a rural Midwestern place, very rural, like as rural as it gets in America, really. And so it's not like a highly it's a very extremely blue collar. Well, I'm not even blue collar. What's below blue collar? Like, it's just,
there's nothing below blue collar.
Yeah, but it's not even. I associate blue collar with, like,
I was blue collar too.
Yeah, just like working class, but more like industrial, urban. So it's just like
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Rural,
It's blue collar and rural.
Yes. So what that meant theologically and church-wise is, there were different churches in the town where I grew up. I grew up in the country, so I wasn't even in the very small town that my house was most proximate to. So there were, oh man, I'm trying to think. There was like a Wesleyan church. There's Lutheran church, Catholic church. And then there was I don't even know if there was a Baptist church, actually. There's so many, there's a lot of churches, even if you're in a rural place. But the church that I grew up in technically was there were two. One was a evangelical free church, and then another one was kind of a Methodist church. And I'm sure the theology that was there and through the pastors was probably akin to those somewhat, but it just wasn't. None of the culture was theological as such, that like all of these conversations that we have and that people talk about, like whether or not it's Calvinist or Arminian or baptism, it was such a it really is so nominally kind of culturally Christian that like those kinds of debates and thinking just never even arose. So much so
Right.
that when as I got older, because really I would say my theological awakening and really coming into an adulthood where I was, and sorry about the platitude, but making my faith my own and trying to figure out what I thought about things didn't even really happen until after I got married, and I moved to Minneapolis with my wife. So that's when it really began, and we were trying to. It was really such a, and I suppose this is just how it happens with everyone. Us moving to Minneapolis was such a, I mean, really such a culture shock because I had grown up such a rural kind of country kid that, and I mean, people may think this is laughable who, have grown up in bigger cities, whether it's like New York, Chicago, or, even cities in Texas or something. Texas is a little different, maybe. But, Minneapolis was such a big city for me that it was just really a somewhat liminal moment where you're reorienting and refiguring out who you are and how you fit in the world because it was just so different than my upbringing.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, it is relative, but there at the same time, there is no difference, like the difference between 0 and 1.
mm,
So if you go from not a city essentially to a real city, that's
yeah,
going to take some adjustment.
yeah, and so then I was trying to figure out what church we should go to because I had always been raised Christian and thought of myself as Christian, but the reality is that during high school and college I was in no meaningful way. Well, I mean, depending on how you frame it, I mean, I just wasn't living a very morally Christian life. I mean, somewhat it's stereotypical, it's like you're going to church. I was going to church somewhat regularly and thinking myself as a Christian. I was involved in like campus ministries at college, but like I was also partying all the time and doing all the things that come with partying. I mean, very regularly. So I was kind of living in two worlds. And then when I moved out here with my wife, I was thinking like, well, now is time to like just basically really grow up and start going to church and figure out, if this is something you want to take seriously, well, let's take it seriously. So I was when we moved out here, interestingly, and this will be interesting to like theological people, at least within the American landscape. I was reading two books simultaneously. One was John MacArthur's book, Hard to Believe. So John MacArthur is this kind of very uh, just kind of stereotypical classic Calvinist, but not like Calvinist, Baptist, dispensational, very he's almost like a archetype of what you would think of as like a certain stripe of post Puritan Jonathan Edwards, but yet fuzzy, non-denominational, but Calvinist, just archetype of a Christian. This is MacArthur, Bible, exegesis. He had this radio show growing up and um, put out tapes and things. So he's this guy that had a huge influence on American evangelicalism. So I was reading his book and I was, very vaguely familiar with him. Like, not because, again, I'm coming out of that culture of just not having any of this solid in my mind. So this gets into the irony of these two books that I was reading. So I was reading his book, but I was reading that side by side with Greg Boyd has a book, Letters from a Skeptic, which is Greg Boyd is kind of one of the prominent thinkers around, he's hard to categorize too, but around open theism. And so, I mean, if you disregard all the stereotypes about Greg Boyd, there's a lot of people who think things about Greg Boyd that, in my opinion, are not accurate. Greg Boyd is very much an evangelical. He's very conservative in many regards, but because of his open theism, people think of him as like, I don't know, something other than what he is. I think he's really a very traditional, classic thinker in many ways. He's just an open theist, whatever you think about that topic. So I'm reading these two books, and I don't even know, like, I wouldn't have known what Calvinism was at the time. I wouldn't have known what open theism was at the time. I'm just reading these books almost just kind of as like a somewhat blank slate, not completely because no one is, but, and then also while trying to figure out where we go to church. So We kind of church hop all over. We go all over. We try out this big church, this big church. This is before the internet. So you're going off of, I mean, or the internet wasn't like big then. I remember when we moved here, we were actually using like physical maps of the city, trying to figure out where to navigate stuff, which is just crazy at the time. Like it took us like a long time to figure out where our closest grocery store was and how to get there, which just seems crazy to people that are post internet. But um, so we went to a lot of different churches. We checked out Woodland Hills, which is Greg Boyd's church. I actually had a meeting with him where I sat down and talked to him, which I mean, it speaks to my personality and my character. It's what probably why we're having a conversation, why I'm part of the little online community that I am. I'm just very passionate and outgoing, and I will just almost naively or um, you know um, happily pursue things that most people just wouldn't even think to do, because they're just like, why would I just personally email Greg Boyd and try to have a conversation with him? And I was just like, I don't even know who he was or anything. I was just like, let's do it.
Wait, so let me clarify. Were you in the same geographical area as he?
Yeah, he's in Minneapolis. So we're
Okay, right. So it seems like his church might be a safe place for an outlier to end up. So was there any specific reason why you were too heretical for Greg Boyd, or what?
No, no. And I mean, and it would be. I think Boyd is much more, um, even though he is really conservative in a lot of ways. I mean, and this speaks to just how these things work. When you are a minority of any kind, I mean, this is where like, I could sound social justice warrior to an overly politically conservative person. It gives you, and this our mutual friend Sam is this way. When you are somewhat of a fringe outsider minority in more dominant cultural landscapes, you learn you have to learn how to operate as a minority. There's certain standards that like the majority just take, and naturally it's this way that the culture. I mean, Jordan Peterson has talked about this. Cultures are whatever is normative in a culture is how a culture will design its structures and laws and rules. I mean, that's just natural. That's you're not gonna you're not going to structure your society around the exception to the rule. You're going to structure it around the rule. I mean, that's what makes sense. Why would you do the other way? So someone like Greg Boyd would be much more tolerant of seemingly heretical or heterodox people, because open theism is a very minority position. um and he's just a very open guy, I think. So we did go there for a while and we liked it. Or we didn't go there for a while. We went there a couple times, and I liked Greg Boyd a lot. Why? So ultimately, where we ended up is we ended up at Bethlehem Baptist, which is John Piper's church. Um, and the reason that is because my mom had just heard of John Piper. This is before my mom, just I think in the same way as me, didn't like, she wouldn't have even been able to talk about like Arminianism or Calvinism or anything at that time, but she had just heard of Piper, and so we ended up going there. And we've had conversations about Piper before. I very much love and admire that man in a lot of ways. He is a I don't know. You used some words to describe him one day when we were texting that I thought were very accurate. He is an incredibly
Zealous.
he's a zealot for sure, but he's not like a bigoted, hypocritical zealot. I mean, any more than any of us are. He quite literally puts his money where his mouth is. He is, particularly in the way that he handles finances. Like John Piper could be, he's not going to be like a Joel Osteen level because he's not preaching a prosperity gospel, but John Piper could be extremely wealthy. I mean, he could. He's sold millions of dollars worth of books. He's not a millionaire. He lives very modestly. I know where he lives. I know where his house is. Um, I know facts about him, like when his youngest daughter was going to school at a particular school that was a private school or whatever, he took out a second mortgage on his home to pay for her tuition. Like that kind of stuff is for someone who could be a millionaire. I mean, and he's very intentionally structured his life that way. And so there are many admirable qualities about John Piper. And so even though I have, as you know, will play out, I have serious theological disagreements with him, and I have particular concerns about church culture, not only in his church, but in just like the broader church of which the culture that he's a part of. I have lots of concerns about that, but it's not because I think he's dubious or there's something wrong with him. That's just, you know, I'm not judging his intentions or anything. It's just a different. So we ended up there. The short version of why we ended up there because of my mother, and I had just never. He's an amazing preacher. His oratory skill and passion is palpable. And I remember when we went there, he was doing kind of his famous preach through Romans. If you're at all familiar with John Piper, you know that he preached exegetically verse by verse through Romans. I mean, there were times when he would preach for multiple weeks on like a phrase within a verse. I mean, he was just dissecting it. It took him years. I think he preached through Romans for like 3 or 4 years or something. And when we went there, he was doing that. And I had just never heard preaching like that in my life. I was floored. And as someone who's, you know, somewhat intellectually inclined, I was just like, it was, um, you know, it was just right up my alley. Like I was just eating it up. I loved it, loved it. Um, and so I was hooked. And so we ended up there. Um, through a series of events and meeting friends, you know, I'll maybe share him with this. My buddy Oli, who I still keep in contact a little bit. I met this guy like trying to connect with people because Bethlehem's a big church. He's in I think he's maybe third generation, definitely second generation halibut fisherman from Alaska, who like he has a crazy story. He got radically saved on like a halibut fishing boat, and ended up like somebody said, like, what good does it do you if you catch all these fish and gain the world and forfeit your soul? And he was just like, you're right. You know, and he just like got off the boat. I mean, it was very like Jesus and the disciples, and went to Bible college. And then he met his wife, got married. And then for their honeymoon, they were either going to go and like basically just go and rent a house and live like either by John Mcarthur's church or John Piper's church. And so they very like literally rented an apartment across the street from Bethlehem Baptist and just like hung out there for their honeymoon. Like that's just what they did. You know, these kinds of people, just radicals. I love radicals, man. And I met this guy. He was hugely into street evangelism. He has WDJD tattooed on both the outsides of his hands. And he just does it to just like start conversations. He's just waiting for people to ask him, like, what's up with that? And he's like, let me tell you, you know. Oh, he's awesome. He's an awesome guy. So I meet him, and he turns me on to this church called Sovereign Grace Ministries, which, I mean, this is all going to be insider baseball for a lot of people. But if people have heard of C.J. Mahaney, more likely Joshua Harris, they're kind of the most prominent people from within that movement. Joshua Harris, who now no longer identifies as a Christian, whatever. That's an aside. So I end up there. This is this should be more tailored to my universalism. Anyhow,
No,
that's a
this
lot.
is fine. I mean, I think that for those who have ears to hear, shall we put it, this is going to be a very interesting
Okay.
um, uh, direction to go. Especially, I really like the details on John Piper, because I think he's fascinating, and this character whom you met, because like on some level you can have all the theological knowledge in the world, sort of analogous to catching all the fish, but the
Yeah.
real dividing line at the end of the day between the baby Christians and the adult Christians is like, who's willing to die now, who's
Yeah.
willing to die to himself and drink from the cup that Jesus drank from, who's ready to pick up his cross and follow. I tell you, I'm not ready.
Yeah.
I can't sacrifice even just a little bit of comfort. You know, that's some days that's how it feels. Some
Yeah.
days I sacrifice slightly more, but I'm not like that dude out on the street witnessing. And at some level, I couldn't do that convincingly. Um,
Yeah.
and so, but that's uh, neither here nor there. But let's continue on. Sort of, you're talking about Sovereign Grace
Yes.
Ministries.
Yeah. So this I would say that church combined with Bethlehem. I mean, it's now a denomination. It wasn't at the time. is probably where I spent my most formative years as a young Christian. I don't know. I mean, at the time, I would have said that I was not really. I mean, this whole perspective has changed also, but I would have during that time I would have said I probably wasn't even a Christian because I mean I became this like hardcore card carrying Calvinist um, because of my time um, at Bethlehem and then also at Sovereign Grace, which is also kind of it's a young, restless, reformed, kind of Baptist, charismatic, but very Calvinist.
There's just such an interesting relationship between Calvinism and fanaticism. Of course, it's not easy to generalize. Some people are sort of born into Calvinism. For
Yeah.
me, when I flirted with Calvinism, it was 2 years before I had any sort of serious model for doing theology. And I was actually a physicalist and a
Mm-hmm.
determinist by inclination
Mm-hmm.
who was seeking irrationally or existentially for belief. And the idea of determinism, I always thought that was incompatible with Christianity, but I was a determinist. And when I figured out there's determinist Christians, that's what made me sort of be Calvinism adjacent. But then there are some people who it's kind of like they get serious about Christianity. They start asking questions like, what do I actually believe? And
Yeah.
then there's something that seems sort of hardcore and bloody, and there's a cost to accepting it. This is a hard saying, who can hear it?
Yeah.
That God predestines some number north or south of half of the human race to hell from the beginning, before all worlds, in his sovereign. Wait, I thought he was loving. No, he's actually power. He's not love. He's power. Um, uh, McDonald has a beautiful quotation about that. It's like mere lonely power has no power to create. Love is the
Mhm.
power of power.
Yeah.
But anyway, these people worship the power of God, and there's like a high price to it. But it's like if I can accept this price, then I can be in the tribe with boundaries, which is very exclusive in some way. Well, I mean, I don't know. Some people are Calvinists. They don't think about the hard cost of being Calvinist. I think some people, the cost is in some ways the incentive. But anyway, that might not have made sense. But
No,
anyway,
I no, I think
I'll
it
let you
does.
keep going.
No, I think there's a couple groups of Calvinists just to finish on kind of those lines of thinking. They're kind of the cultural Calvinists that are more nominal, that don't take it as seriously. But then, like the kind of evangelical Calvinists, the people who come into Calvinists who really own it. I think it's a combination of. I don't know if it's a. I mean, it is an elevation of power almost to the top of the value structure to a degree. I don't think they would ever say it that way. They would take and I think to color it positively or to steelman it, it's more of a. I mean, they would talk about sovereignty because sovereignty is a. I mean, that is like a key understanding for them. Even sovereign grace, right? That almost juxtaposition, almost paradox of sovereign grace. Um, I think they would call it like it's and the positive aspects of it for me, just to make it personal again, and what I really loved about that church that's really formed me in my young, at least. Uh, See, I would say I wasn't a Christian before, but I would say it this way now. Like my owning and my growing into an adult existential kind of Kierkegaardian Christianity, where like it had become my own. That definitely happened there. And what I really loved about that culture and still love about that culture is there's a deadly seriousness about God and faith and sin that I think a lot of they're not flippant about it all, and they definitely take the intellectual aspects of it seriously. Although I would still qualify that and have beefs with it because I think to bring in like psychoanalysis and psychology and levels of even deeply theological stuff, whether it's like nous versus intellect stuff or like what I will talk about with the egoic intellect. I actually think they have very deep. Peter Rollins would put it this way, and that'll just immediately stop the ears of some. But Peter Rollins would say that their belief is rooted almost in like a deeper a deeper fear and disbelief. They're almost using conscious belief as a defense mechanism about a deep insecurity. And I think a lot of that is what's going on within that crowd. They actually are terrified of their disbelief, which is why they believe so ardently. Um, but whatever, you can't.
They're terrified of hell too,
I
which I
think
mean, as one should be. I mean,
yes, yeah, yeah.
I mean, the thing is, in some sense, my position is even if you espouse belief, you don't strictly know if you're going to hell or not. Uh, I'm a universalist, and a lot of people imagine that that means no hell. But I believe in hell. I just think that people get out, or at least I suspect that they do. I think there are compelling philosophical reasons to believe that they do. When people say philosophy isn't everything, but or the Bible trumps philosophy. But my problem is like, what are you bringing to the Bible that's pre-biblical and not philosophical? It seems to me you don't ever really escape the philosophical, the necessity of doing philosophy. Um, but no, yeah, they're terrified of hell, and there's this, it's like we went from, in the Reformation, the idea that faith is a necessary condition for salvation, but it's not sufficient. Works is also a necessary condition, to the Reformed view that faith is necessary and sufficient. But here's the catch: it's like, if you have faith, you can be certain of salvation. But how can you be certain that you have faith
Right. Well, and
or works
that's what
or
throws
something?
that's what throws a Calvinists into. And I mean, and I've seen this anecdotally. Not, I mean, you laid it out intellectually very clearly, um, in an abstract way, but I've seen this many times, and within myself, anecdotally, is that people who are Calvinists they have that cognitive dissonance that you just outlined, which is very real. Is that we are saved by faith and not by works? Yes, and so you can't know that someone is justified based on their works. But then, how do I know that I have faith? How do I know that I'm elect? Any any Calvinist who is at all self-reflective and has any degree of ability or gift of inward self, inspection, is going to struggle with that question. They all do. They all do. And I don't think, and this is what's hard about Calvinism, is it's a intellectually, at least I think, it's the appeal, but also the detriment is it's a very closed system. It's this tight systematic theology, and I don't think they have an answer to that question, in the same way that, like, one of our previous conversations on randos, I also don't think they have an answer for, is like giving the metaphysics and the ontology of like what a man is. I don't think they can do that either. But so then you had said something earlier about hell that I wanted to use to segue back into my story, if it's cool. Is you talked about hell and how a lot of people think universalists just deny hell. Hearing my kids in the background squeal. um, and so one of the things that happened in my journey is, so I was, to get back to the specifics of hell, is I was raised in just what I would say is the kind of the classic American evangelicalism, which is, so the perspective on hell is one that you're just given and inherited at birth, and you don't even know what that is. You don't even know that there's options. You just see hell, and it's basically the Far Side comics, which really is eternal conscious torment. And that was my view, although I didn't even know it. It's kind of like, it reminds me of that um, David Foster Wallace illustration from that famous speech. Fish. The two young fish are swimming along, and they meet the old fish, and the old fish is just like, "How's the water?" And they look at each other just quizzically, and he swims off, and they look at each other, and they're like, "What's water?" People who are raised in American evangelicalism, water to them, their hell water, is eternal conscious torment, and they don't even know it. They're just blissfully, well, not blissfully, torturedly ignorant of, of that view. So at one point I moved, I'll bring in, this has a few connections. I was on YouTube one day, and I watched a video. It just came with my algorithm. But, YouTube, it's just this amazing thing. Very much like Paul Vanderklay's thing of Jordan Peterson. This video popped up, which is a debate between Chris Day, who I think you're familiar with, and I should remember the other guy's name. I never do. But essentially, it was a exegetical scriptural debate on eternal conscious torment versus annihilationism. And I didn't even really know what that was at the time, but I remember watching the debate. It was about 2 hours. And I remember getting done with it and just thinking, like, because I was formed in these like exegetical sola scriptura reformed Calvinist things. And Chris Dade is like a hardcore reformed Calvinist preterist. He's interestingly, at least last time I talked to him, he was a Christian physicalist. Like, we're not tight, but I've interacted with him some. Um, so he's this guy that was just like, in all these ways, he was so close to me and speaks my language. But lo and behold, in this video, he's presenting this case for biblical and like annihilationism, this view of hell, which also can be called conditional immortality. Never heard of it before. And I watched this debate, and I think just like, okay, and I remember having this moment where I was just like, okay, well, wait, like Chris Date clearly won this debate, like he annihilated this guy, pun intended, and but I was just like, but wait, that's not the right view. But I said, like, he was the one that was making all the solid exegetical cogent points. The other guy was doing just what he was really doing was really poor philosophy, actually, and and doing a bunch of like intellectual gymnastics and just making no good points. And I was just like, what? So then this sent me down this long path of discovering people like Edward Fudge and this whole wealth of rethinking hell and annihilationism resources and books and YouTube and things. And so when you said this before, Edward Fudge with hell, it's not that. I think this is an important thing for people who are somewhat, and this isn't a good or bad thing, but ignorant of the doctrine of hell, is that Christians who are in there's three Orthodox views of hell, which is eternal conscious torment, annihilationism, and universalism. They're all Orthodox. Christians have held them, throughout all of history, which is just baffling to most people. But then I think you talk about somebody like Edward Fudge, who he's written the like seminal text on annihilationism, which is called consuming fire, I think. So that's basically the idea: is all Christians would affirm hell, the reality of hell. I mean, there's maybe some Christians that would say it's merely figurative, but I don't know. That's a little too liberal for me. I don't know how you'd really even talk about that or defend that. You'd have to just get way too fuzzy with the Bible, which I'm not comfortable with. I mean, I know what they're getting at, but anyhow. So all
Yeah, I
Christians
don't
would.
know. You know what I find interesting on the topic of hell. It's a little bit sideways, but
Okay.
um, I did an episode recently on just distressing near-death experiences, because the typical near-death experience that you hear about is, oh, I went up out of my body. There was a tunnel. There was a lot of love and light. I saw my family members, and they were like, "We love you, but it's not your time." The end.
Yeah.
Um, and that's what most of it is. But you read the distressing ones, and man, like you can't imagine, you can't invent this stuff.
Sorry,
Um,
I'm having an interrupt. Just
you know
pause.
that
Okay, we're
there
re-recording.
was a brief interruption, and both of us sort of lost our train of thought, but it doesn't matter. It's all related. See, the
Yep.
thing is, universalism is so interesting. What's one of the most interesting things about universalism is the way that it is so bound up with conceptions of hell. You would think, if
Oh yeah.
I talk about, well, actually, I was talking about near-death experiences.
Yes.
But universalism, you would think rather as you would with near-death experiences, like, this is positive, this is good. I have a near-death experience, I go through the tunnel, it's love and light. Universalism, same thing. Everyone's loved and happy and saved. But the reality is, if you are thinking about universalism a lot, you're just thinking about hell and the limits of agency all the time. And that's because predicates are defined on their complements. The thing through its contrast, its opposite, or its negation. And the true paradox of universalism is that if you think about it for any significant length of time, you realize you're spending most of that time just thinking about hell. And in terms of an argument for the reality of hell, I find distressing near-death experiences like totally fascinating, because like they're so hideous and horrible that you couldn't even imagine it.
Mm,
Um, it's like it's not the kind of thing that you can invent. Uh, and and For me, well, of course, see the liberal Protestant or New Age move there would be to say, well, it's just a projection of your own consciousness, right?
yeah.
Um, and For me, it's a very interesting question why it is the case that this world, full of duality and darkness and danger and doubt and uncertainty, um, should terminate in a world where, suddenly everything is love and light, and there's no possibility of harm or danger or regret or anything in the afterlife. The alchemist dictum is, um, uh, as above, so below. But I almost want to reverse that and suspect that if this world has danger, maybe that world does too. That not every being you meet, in the afterlife is going to be a, 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 a an entity that wants to represent reality truthfully to you.
Yeah.
But anyway, for whatever reason, a lot of people just deny hell. Um, but you were talking about annihilationism, talking about
Yeah.
fudge and
Yep. So then that was kind of the next step on my journey, is because of my very Protestant, taking the Bible seriously and exegesis, and very seriously respecting the intellectual structure and rigor, and being a Calvinist and all that. I mean, those were just annihilationism just fits right in with that. I mean, annihilationism is so so basically I studied that topic for a few years, and became an annihilationist. And what is interesting is I met a guy. I actually ended up going to a Rethinking Hell conference in Dallas, which is where I met Preston. I had been interacting with Preston Sprinkle a bunch, but so we're buddies, and that's where I met him, because that's where he kind of came out as an annihilationist publicly, as a somewhat. He's a well-known in in the evangelical world theologian. And I met Chris Day and hung out with those guys, and they're all annihilationists. But I met another guy there who I actually lost contact with. I was going to keep up with him, he's a professor. He's a philosophy. He was an associate philosophy professor at a Texas school down there. I forget the name of the school now. I could probably find it because I had his paper, and he was doing like a smaller side presentation at the Rethinking Hell conference that I went to in Dallas. And I believe that his own personal self identity is an eternal conscious torment view, but he is a fascinating guy. I actually, now that's making me want to reconnect with him and figure out who he was and stuff, because he was a great guy. But he framed it this way, and I think this is true. He kind of framed it almost around temperament, where he said, excuse me, if your temperament is such that you are um, kind of like a traditionalist and a conservative type, and you were raised in America, he said you're gonna naturally be an adherent of eternal conscious torment. And then he said, if you're more of like a true exegetical type, that's a true Bible believing type person, and you're within, I would say, the kind of the Christian rationalist frame, which is all adherents of sola scriptura are, whether or not they know it. He said, you're going to be an annihilationist. And I think that's like, I would affirm that. I really do. And then he said, if you're more of a philosophical minded person and existentially, he said, you're probably going to end up being a universalist. And I think that really holds up and is very true, because oh, different phone call. Sorry. They'll probably get that quick. Because I've also heard, I broke it down this way, that I think if you just take the straight biblical text, and Rethinking Hell is great at this, from the Old Testament through the New Testament, and you just look at them from a kind of analytical, scientific, statistics, let's break down the words into their root words and what they mean etymologically. And if you do all that, 80% of the text in like a proof texting kind of rationalist way are going to be annihilationist. I think it's about 80%. I really do. And then And I would argue that probably 19.9% of the texts are pretty clearly universalist.
Well, yeah. So for me, it's tough because it's like, how do you separate it from higher level interpretation? For me, the real problem is the word aionios or aeonios, which
Mhm.
is actually, literally does not mean eternal. It
Yep.
means the opposite in the sense that it refers to some age or interval. It's
Mm.
not truly endless. It has a beginning and an end, and in many contexts, it's used, in fact, to mean temporary, lasting some duration. Usually an ion is an age, it's like a lifespan.
So if you had
But
to translate that word though into English, you would say age of the ages.
well, you could aeon aeonios, like tos aeon aeonios, something like that. See, my Greek sucks,
Yeah.
but like unto the age of ages.
Unto the age of
So
ages.
it means that sometimes, and the thing is, it's a tricky word because sometimes it really does carry connotations of eternal,
Mhm.
because it means like of God as opposed to like of the natural world.
Well, right.
Uh,
Even there, like what you're saying, sometimes it means eternal. This is the problem in English is these things get equivocated because we
yeah,
often think, this is to your point, I think, we often think in English, people who are raised within biblical traditions, that eternal means quantity of time, unending quantity of time, but the biblical word eternal, I would argue, equally could be thought of as like quality of time. So,
yeah, yeah,
like,
yeah. So
yeah.
it's tricky. I would say the strongest arrow in the quiver of the particularist, or the non-universalist, is Matthew 25, in which the goats are said to go to Ionios punishment and the sheep to Ionios life. The reasoning is the life that we have in Christ is eternal, and Ionios means eternal there. Therefore, we should assume it means the same thing for the goats. What
Yes.
I what
However,
I say, go ahead.
finish your thought.
What I say is that the trouble with, it's like, so you would say Ionios means eternal, at least in that verse. That's what Augustine said.
Hmm.
And I think the problem with the logic of same quantifier for the two different groups of people in the same verse is that later on in First Corinthians, Paul says, as in Adam all died, so in Christ all will be made alive.
Right.
If that logic is like, all dominating and all controlling, then
Yep.
there's a contradiction in the Bible.
Yep.
So one of these has to break. And
Right.
oh well, yeah, I'll let you
So I've just been I went so deep down the annihilationist rabbit hole that verse in particular gets treatment many times, and so I know what the like what a good annihilationist would say in response to this, and I think it's still a good argument is that the problem with Matthew 25 from a is it 25 is that what it is? It's 25, I think. I can't remember the exact verse, but it's that verse that you're talking about. It's like a classic proof text for eternal conscious torment. People think, but I would say the difficulty isn't with the word eternal and its parallelism. The difficulty, and this is one of the best case for exegetical annihilation, is the word punishment. Because people in English, because of that whole like fish not knowing their wet thing, they read a word like punishment and they read it without even thinking as punishing. Punishment is not, and I mean, I'll share this with you, and you can put it in the show notes if you want or whatever. Is that Rethinking Hell put out an article? It's by Glenn. What is his name now? He's got his doctorate now. He's a Kiwi. He's a New Zealander. Glenn. What is his name? Whatever. He wrote a article which I think is awesome for like grammar nerds. It's on the polysemy of deverbal nouns. And so it's basically making the point that words in English, what a deverbal noun is, a word in English that it starts off as a verb, but then it is made into a noun by adding ment. So punishment is one of those things. It comes from the root punish, to punish, which is an active thing, but then punishment, it becomes a noun, and it has a polysemy to it. It has multiple meanings, all of which are contextually driven. So what an annihilationist would say is, and there's really great things for it. So like punishment is one of the classic ones, or Redemption is another one, because you can flip it like this from Hebrews, because a lot of people will say punishment means the act of punishing. So here's the illustration. Let me lay out the argument. Is they would say that punishment can mean either it can be either this ongoing process, or it can be just like an act. So they use this illustration because another word that's a deverbal noun is translation. So you could say these two things. You could say the translation lasted 4 weeks, or you could say the translation lasted 2,000 years. Those mean different things. One of them means the act of translating lasted 4 weeks. So that's like a verb. That would be like eternal conscious punishing. But the other one is like the translation, the existent thing lasted, this long. So what an annihilationist would say is that you cannot read the Bible exegetically and read punishment and automatically assume it means one and not the other. So what an annihilationist would say is like, yeah, eternal punishment, but the eternal punishment is capital punishment. You're dead. It lasts forever. You die and it lasts forever, which is not ongoing torture. It's like you're beheaded and you're dead. Which is and I've seen this many, many times. So what I just laid out to you is logically consistent. It holds up. But I've had this experience over and over and over, is I see people who are completely ignorant of the arguments for annihilation, who've never been exposed to it, who've never thought about it. And you walk them through this and you explain it to them, and they just go dead-eyed. Like they cannot comprehend the words that you're saying to them, because they're just like, what? How can punishment not mean eternal conscious tormenting? They just like, they can't. Their whole life they've just read it and interpreted this, and they cannot see it otherwise. Seeing they do not see.
Yeah, well, that maybe I can understand them a little bit, because on some level, the idea of punishing someone by killing them is a strange idea. Because usually, punishment is either retributive or corrective. I punish you to make you suffer. But if you're dead, at least in annihilationism, the whole point is that in your death, you're no longer suffering. That's the appeal.
But like capital punishment, right?
Well, that's the thing. That I'm saying, that's a strange phrase. I punish you by killing you. What does that teach you, and how does that make you suffer? So because normally we think of punishment as like, it's something that I inflict for a purpose that it has to do with either changing the behavior of the one who is punished, or by making them really regret what they did, which also ends up changing their behavior. That's I think that ultimately sort of the deep rationale for retributive punishment is actually correction. But anyway, but no, the thing is, the annihilationists are not without their arguments. Each of these three views, that they have advantages and disadvantages. Well, it's interesting, because I think on some level, maybe the traditionalists are right to dislike annihilationism, fearing it as a sort of gateway idea, because how many universalists were annihilationists before they were universalists? It seems very many.
Maybe, yeah, and for some reason, I mean, I don't know. Do you think this is true, that the bulk of people who are Christians, who just have this kind of bred into them belief in eternal conscious torment as hell, like this is hell. It's kind of like the atonement is penal substitution. Like that is it. To say it's something different is to deny the whole thing. So like, unless hell is eternal conscious torment, you're denying it. So do you think there's more fear among that general demographic? It seems to me that like universalism is the boogeyman versus annihilationism. Annihilationism is like, and that's a fascinating thing, because that goes to your point about what is, and George MacDonald talks about this a lot. What is punishment? Like, is it merely retributive? Is it rehabilitative? What's going on? Because
George MacDonald is the best.
Huh?
George MacDonald is the best, because he captures everything when he phrases it as the Calvinists, or the certain stripes of Christians, they view Jesus as saving us from the punishment for sin.
Yeah.
But rightly understood, the punishment for sin is corrective and therefore good. What
Yeah.
Jesus really saves us from it, and what is true death, is sin itself. Um, and that conception is sufficiently, I guess, polysemous to allow you to make sense of all the biblical metaphors at once. Because I said earlier, the universalism, the annihilationism, the ECT, they all have their strengths, and then they all have their weaknesses. But if you understand this perishing, this death, as really sin itself, then you can understand how hell is simultaneously a place of torment, a place of destruction in which the sinful self dies,
Mm-hmm.
um, and a place from which one gets out in order to better jive with the Pauline verses suggestive of universalism.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, I was sort of potentially derailing us. But yeah, you were talking about annihilation, and
So that was my so if it is true that
it being a little bit more acceptable to the traditionalists than universalism, because universalism is just like, Hitler commits suicide, and then when he wakes up, he's partying with Jesus in heaven.
right,
It's like
so
there's no.
this is that's the straw man, or that's the fear, I think, of a lot of people who don't like universalism, is that they think that universalism is cavalier in regards to sin or holiness or something, which I think is a complete straw man. That's maybe true in some cases. I mean, I'm sure there are universalists that are kind of just like, kumbaya, whatever, it's fine, like Jesus is forgiving, it's all good, but that's not, all the universalists that I know in real life who are real universalists are just like some of the most radical, like taking sin seriously people that I know. They aren't at all cavalier. So, but to the point of like that, of universalism being the great fear of people, whether or not it's accurate, and that annihilation is a gateway. Case in point, I don't know that annihilationism was a gateway. I think it was a gateway in this regard, that my annihilationism was for me the beginning of, I would never, I don't like, I wouldn't say deconstruction, because deconstruction carries with it certain, um, it has certain baggage attached with it. And I never went through a deconstruction of my faith. I went through a deconstruction of my intellectual attachments that I associated with my faith, which I think is very key. What annihilationism did for me was make me, I asked the question. I remember having this thought and this existential moment of just being like, when I finally became an annihilationist, and like, and I had new eyes to see what I had never seen before, and that former ignorance had gone away, and I was just like, oh my goodness, this is like unbelievably clear to me. And I remember having this exact thought. I said, what else don't I have a clue about that I just thought was really clear to me? So what annihilation did to me was it gave me, uh, I would, to some degree, intellectual humility, to just be like, I don't have a clue. It made me question. It put everything on the table intellectually, which I think to a lot of people, because of their temperament and their culture, would maybe be terrifying. But for me, it never was terrifying, and it never really affected my faith, just because I think my temperament is one it's very open. And so I never had I never had the problem of conflating my ideas with God with my faith in God. Those two things were always completely different. And so when I started doubting all this stuff and just trying to be like, what else? What else am I totally just oblivious about? My faith wasn't ever in question. And so then eventually what happened is I was an annihilationist for quite a while. Um, I'm trying to think of how long that would have been, because um, at least 3, 4, 5 years. And my, like, I wouldn't have called myself just like a professing, like flat out universalist until a number of years even after that. It was kind of like a slow move of where I was like, I'm a hopeful universalist. That's kind of like the step. And then I just got to the point where I was just like, I'm just gonna what really happened to me is whereas I'm just gonna say I'm a universalist because and really what happened is I got to the point of George MacDonald was big. Reading the book Lilith was really big. George MacDonald's arguments in his sermon Justice were really big. But eventually I got to the point where it was really more about my move um, from Christian rationalism to Christian mysticism. And so I got to the point where I was just like, I don't trust my abstract intellect and my logic and my ability to dice facts and information in a disembodied way more than I trust my hope in what I intuit and perceive and wish and dream is the best story. To me those began to hold equal weight. And so like even to this day, and I'll talk about Preston in here, like me and Preston have a lot of these conversations privately where I think he's different than that. Preston is also a hopeful universalist. I think anyone who has a heart is, somewhat, but they just maybe don't see that, or they don't have the ability to see that from scripture, which to me is just like it's an elevation of your ability to parse facts and logic than it is to trust in what you see as beautiful. And that's what happened for me existentially is I'm just like, to me this is clearly the best story and more beautiful, and I trust that now as just as good, if not a better guide of discerning truth than I trust my logic fact mind. And that's really when I came to that conviction, I was just like, I'm just going to call myself a universalist. Like it's irrelevant to me because all those annihilationist facts, like that big thing that I walked you through, like I still know all that stuff. I think those are good arguments. I see that in scripture too. It's just ultimately at the end of the day, I'm just like, I don't, my understanding and view of God isn't so much shaped by like, it's not scientific. Like I just don't approach the Bible like a scientist. I approach it like it's a love letter, and that's going to sound like really, I don't know, fuzzy, slippery, postmodern, relativist. Like when you come at that from certain frames, that's what you're going to hear. I don't think it is. I mean, I think it has robust, logical, and philosophical arguments to defend it as well. But ultimately, I guess I think at the end of the day, and whatever, I'll end it by in this spiel by proof texting scripture at you is like whatever doesn't proceed from faith is sin, and faith is rooted in faithfulness and trust and is inherently intrinsically relational and personal, which is not cold logic. It's rooted in desire and love and trust. And I think those are things that many Christians would affirm. I just don't think they talk about their doctrine and their faith in that way. You know.
Well, I don't know how much time you have left, but it seems to me we're at a point where we should observe the crucial distinction between hopeful universalism and sort of out and out confident universalism. And because it's actually a very significant philosophical distinction between those two. And one of them is, it can be said to be led much more by the heart. And it's kind of like this almost C.S. Lewis type thing of you have to believe whatever you must believe about God in order to let him be the ideal of goodness in your mind. If you can't see God as commanding, say, the genocide of these Canaanite children, and have that fit with your idea of God as like the good, maximal goodness, then that has to be let go. And that you should trust like whatever your highest conception of the good is to lead you to God.
Right. Well, otherwise you're lying to yourself. Like if
right?
your ultimate conception of good is not that, but you're like, I have to affirm it because it's this true thing, then
Well,
you're
that's because God's goodness is something radically alien and other than what we call goodness, but we still call it goodness, but it's not actually goodness.
right.
So just wrap your mind around that. But No, so there's that one sort of hopeful universalism. Hans von Balthasar, he just did what I said. He's just like Matthew 25 versus the verse in First Corinthians, and just don't break the tension. Sort of view the hell verses existentially as like, this is a place that you could end up, but now you still have the freedom to choose, and we also don't know whom God in His mercy is going to spare from punishment, versus who will eventually be subject, either through their own will or God's or both, to that terrible final fate. And then there's the other side, which is confident universalism, and the reasons you have to the reasons for espousing that are interesting, because they they they're pretty, they have to be capable of some they have to be able to lift a lot of weight, philosophically speaking. They have to be hardcore reasons. And like David Bentley Hart, uh, his argument, or his main reason for being a confident universalist, was it has to do with the nature of the good and the nature of all human striving as being purposive and aiming toward the good, and that even when it falls short of the good, it was still aiming at the good. And for
Very
me, it's
Edwardian.
hmm?
Very Edwardian, actually.
Oh, like Jonathan Edwards.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, he's I mean, he was a capable philosopher, but at the end of the day, he was willing to say that God's goodness is not goodness, it's schmudness. We just analogically call it goodness for some reason.
Yeah.
um
Right now,
and
reality. Back to David Bentley Hart. Good. Purpose.
yeah, and
Purposiveness.
that's a close cousin to the reason that I am a universalist. It's the same reason, just looked at from a different angle. Socrates said, "No one knowingly does evil," and the
Yep.
way I see it is like, if the good is objectively good, that means it's good for reasons,
Mm.
of which one is either ignorant or cognizant. And if you're cognizant, you're going to do the good, and if you don't, it's because you're ignorant. And that ignorance, it's like one is either responsible for it or one isn't, and that speaks to, or that gets at, what the limits of human agency are, if any. And some people would like to pretend that there are none whatsoever. But that's a premise that Hart leverages as well: the limits of human agency. Something there, like the nature of the good, as capital G good, and it's like sort of the end and purpose of all striving, and the limits of human agency, and the fact that we're not self-sufficient, autonomous, like radically self-sustaining, beings.
Mm.
We in God we live and move and have our being.
Yep.
And so there's some sense in which God is ultimately responsible for everything, and the Calvinists sort of have that right. God as ultimate reality cannot sort of wiggle out of it and say, "Oh no, that was you." It's like,
Yep.
but our friend Nate, he gave to me a very interesting reason from the heart, I guess, that was also from David Bentley Hart,
Mm.
Hart. And it was, to me, like a very, very good reason for universalism, interestingly, but a sideways sort of reason. And that was from The Doors of the Sea, where you just look at the utter, abject, seemingly senseless suffering and horror of something like that tsunami. And then the sort of, well, I don't know Nate's thinking behind it that well, but what to me the linkage is, it's almost an irrational linkage, like that if there's this much abject uh, tragedy, that it does have its obverse in some kind of final reconciliation in which
Mm.
truly everything is mended, like that point of like maximal suffering and death. It does somehow indicate a corresponding terminus or endpoint in which truly every tear is wiped away,
Mm.
and there's no way of conceiving that other than that everyone is saved.
Yeah.
And like it's a very sort of powerful reason. It's not the sort of one the sort of reason that I would draw upon apologetically, but I mean, ultimately, who knows for sure? Who can claim to know? That's not a thing that maybe I give that impression sometimes, but I don't claim to know with certainty that everyone is saved. Like that's it's kind of nuts. I don't know that with 100% certainty. There's different kinds of certainty.
Well, this is the. I mean, this is the. and this is where I've kind of moved, I guess, personally, but I also think it's true philosophically, and I think a lot of the the philosophic tradition in the West has kind of shown this, is that I don't think, and these are things that I've said before, but I don't think that knowledge, true knowledge, is something that can be. True knowledge is lived. True knowledge is rooted in
Right.
being, and so the kind of, just to even speak of knowledge as certainty is to necessarily abstract it. When you make it like certain and universal and no longer personal, you're divorcing it from your being. And I mean, and I guess, I mean, that's kind of an abstract thing to wrap your head around, but I think that it's true. And I would argue that no one, I agree with you. So everyone is agnostic in that sense. You can't abstract your knowing in that way and apply it to other people. Like, the only way, I mean, this is probably a lot of what Kierkegaard is about. I mean, even though I'm no Kierkegaard expert, but like, and this is what faith is the only knowledge that you can have is personal. It's lived. That's what it means to know something, is to embody it. This is why, I mean, this gets into, I mean, an aside, but maybe it's a plug for a future conversation, one that I want to have with Nate, with Sam, perhaps with yourself, is that um, when it, ultimately it's all about incarnation, because your knowledge, when your knowledge is real, it's incarnated in yourself. Like, that's what your real knowledge is. Anything that is real is incarnational. I mean, I would almost say it that simply. Like, whatever is real, whatever exists, is incarnated. Nothing exists that isn't incarnated. And I mean that like really technically, I think. And I mean, that maybe seems like just mere wordplay, but I don't think it is. I think it's rooted in like the deepest levels, the deepest fractal realities of God and Trinitarian
You're
theology.
talking about something like final participation.
Yeah, I think that is what we are. I think that is what we are becoming. So, like, in the same way, you said something earlier that's connected. Kalepa, I want to give a shout out to Kalepa because Heidinger from the Discord community, but he said something responding to me, I think, in a comment on maybe the Paul Vanderklay, Vervaeke, JP Marceau, like the most recent conversation. I don't know if you followed that, but it was about um, and then I'll probably have to go after this pretty soon. But this is a really interesting, great idea. I'm giving my daughter a thumbs up in the window. So I don't know if you remember when Sam Adams had John Vervaeke on his show, and they talked about um, evolution and being kind of this. I can't remember if they were talking about it being like a Gnostic idea that, but essentially it's the idea that, like, the idea of there's like an idea of a crocodile, and it's almost like a Platonic ideal that evolution is it kind of like this force that is trying on all these new forms, in which it's moving all these different crocodiles, and some die, but eventually at the end of that, it's moving toward this ideal form, which is the perfect crocodile. That's an interesting idea, and what I think is happening with us right now, with humanity, and what theosis and final participation and here I'll say salvation is that we are all the particulars of of an image of God that are moving toward the already existent fullness of what a real human being is, which is the perfection of Christ, who is the full icon of God. And he is this Platonic thing that isn't a mere abstraction. It's the opposite of that. It's the perfect incarnation of that which existed, which is the center of human history, in which we are being driven, pulled forward into moving into. And we are doing that collectively, we are doing that individually, we're doing that cosmically. We're being pulled into the fullness of Christ, who is the firstborn of new creation. I mean, I think that's what's happening. And so I mean, I can't remember what was my jumping off point. There was some connection to what you had said. What were you just saying right before I went on that tear?
Well, I was talking about David Bentley Hart. We were talking about can one be justified in saying that what, everyone is going to be saved, and then beyond that, we
Oh,
were talking.
I think I know. So so we were talking about certainty. Like, can I know for certain?
Correct.
So it was
And
kind of
we're just trying things on.
yeah. So it's kind of like this. And even that I think is really like this dualism between it's playing with this knowledge in an abstract way, whereas I actually think that whole game, like that I think most Christians, like Christian apologetics, like apologists are playing, and Sam Harris's are playing, and most of the modern world is playing this game of like, how can we know what true reality is? You can't, in the way that you're talking about knowing. You can't ever know what reality is in that way, but you can know what reality is in the way where you incarnate your belief and participate in that final full image, and live into that. That's how
Yeah.
you can know, which is
It's a sort of
intrinsically personal.
Jordan Peterson idea where it's
Yeah.
like you have to take this tactic and employ it in the game of games over the longest of time frames and see if it actually works. And you never actually know. All your knowledge is provisional, uh, uh, you know, until such time as as it actually sort of comes undone. Your ideas, they come undone. They no longer serve as useful guides. And yeah, there's this sort of like ultimate, almost arbitrariness to what nature, God, ultimate reality, the ultimate selection principle. You
Yeah.
never know. Like even God, like it sort of has that unpredictability. Like what's he doing in the Bible, saying things that are like the opposite of what he commands us to do? Like Abraham, go sacrifice your child.
Yeah.
Uh, is like what is he doing? And so like it's this idea that there is perhaps something in God which is like terribly and finally arbitrary. Maybe, I don't know.
It's not even arbitrary, because like this is where I was thinking about this earlier. I was having a conversation and with some friends around a bonfire last night, and I even so I've talked to you about what I call the iconic vision, or even viewing. I think there's a way to start perceiving reality. I love to talk about perception because I think it's deeper than epistemology, and like deeper than ideas, and deeper than abstraction, because perception is it's phenomenological, and it's biological, and it's like really fundamental, just like how you perceive reality. And and I was talking about it. One of the ways I've been really just meditating and contemplating a lot on Jesus's seeing but not seeing. Because what is so fascinating to me about that is, and I was telling my wife this, is like fundamentally perception, all perception, whether it's sight, touch, taste, smell, all of those things, all perception is, I'll just illustrate it with sight, is seeing, not seeing. So what it means to see, and Peterson and actually Peugeot talked about this really well. What it means to see is that something, some aspect, some um, particular, out of the infinity of what's available to you in your vision, it's infinite. What you could Jordan Peterson talks about this when he talks about robotic sight. They have a really hard time teaching robots how to see, because how do you tell them what to look at? We don't, you don't know. um, but all of your vision, like me talking to you, me looking at a lamp, me looking at anything, when I see, what is happening is that my salience, my focus, my attention is zoned in on one thing in spite of everything else. That's what it means to see. So seeing is not seeing. Really, technically, you don't see everything else to see this. You stop seeing all of this to see this. But all your perception works that way. And that's inherently a hierarchy. That's what it is. You're elevating this thing in spite of everything else. And there's a way, I think there's a way, like that, just that happens to you on like the deepest levels of your being, where you can begin to see reality in a way that is not, that is non-dual, essentially, that isn't seeing, that's seeing this and everything else at the same time, but it's seeing this in light of this. And yes, this thing is elevated and salient and popping, but you don't lose the forest for the trees. You see both simultaneously. And that's what iconography is. You're never like, so then even questions like, it's the same way that you can say the church is the ark, is Mary, is the womb, is the cosmos. And you don't mean that as like mere metaphor or like psychological abstraction. You mean it symbolically. They're all the same thing. It's unity. You're starting to see unity amidst the multiplicity. You're seeing connections in everything. And there really is fundamentally a way where you start to perceive the world that way. And people who don't see the world that way or don't think they see the world that way will hear this and they think that that this is just rhetoric. It's not. It's more fundamental. It's really it's a way of being in the world that I think changes the way that you see things, so that my whole point with that is so that the questions of like the kind of being who would ask, how can we know if the incarnation was a real historical thing or just a metaphor, is an irrelevant question. Like, you don't even care about that question anymore. Like, it just doesn't even like it's like water off a duck's back. You know what I mean?
That's a hard saying for me and for some people, but no, I do understand what you mean. There's a sense in which Christianity would be true, even if it were not true, because it just remains psychologically and existentially true. There are issues there, and I think about that a great deal in connection with our friend Sam's podcast, because I think whether or not the historical Jesus of Nazareth was and is God, it's like the idea of the ultimate Jesus exists conceptually, like as a limit, as a logical terminus, as an archetype. And so whether or not it was embodied in a historical person, it still exists. But then, like, the question is, like, if God didn't perform that miracle, so to speak, if he didn't perform the miracle of the incarnation, what of significance changes? Is it truly the case that nothing of significance would change? Like, what if every miracle God did was actually a hallucination? None of it was real. Now, like, the thing is, on some level, I feel like you feel like that's probably missing the point of all that you just said. But that's where my mind goes. Maybe I'm just like an incorrigibly sort of a little left-brained logic chopper. But
No, I mean, I know what you're saying, and yeah,
it's a question that well, the thing is, I always game things out, I think, to a level that most people don't, and then I ask, like, what appear to me to be the next sequential questions, because I am very linear, but um I travel a long way down certain logical trajectories.
yeah.
And so, yeah, to me, it seems like if he didn't make that miracle real, why did he perform these other miracles, or did he? And then what are
So
the
right.
implications of this? But
So in me saying everything that I said before that, where I was saying some of those questions to
you
me.
weren't saying that he wasn't real. You're
No,
just
no,
saying
no.
that, even, yeah, you're just saying that it's ultimately of lesser significance
I'm just
compared with.
saying, like, the question just ceases to be valuable to me because I don't even see the world that way, which isn't to deny, which I think a lot of conservatives fear is like some kind of postmodern tactic to deny historicity. No,
It's not. It's
no.
just seeing what's relevant over the longest of time frames. Because when you think about, like, a being like God, if you can call him a being, um, who is, like, hypothetically ultimate reality, is not subject to any external constraints at all.
Yeah.
It's like, you think about what is the highest or most valuable level of communication to him. It seems to me that it actually is, like, symbolism, that symbolism is the realest and deepest thing to God. Because on some level, that's all there is, finally, is just communication.
Well, it's just
There's no constraints that have to be navigated.
well,
There's
it's that book that I showed you before we started recording from John how was Zizulas?
Oh,
Zizulas?
yes, whoever.
Yeah,
Yeah,
whoever. Yeah. He's a but it's communion as being, yes. And so the symbolic, I do think, is the deepest level, because not only is it communication, not only is it linguist, not only is it word and representation, figure and ground, it's all of those things at once. But like the symbolic vision and the symbolic representation is the unity amidst multiplicity. It's like what I was
yeah,
saying. It's
yeah.
Mary, ark, world,
Well, if
cosmos,
you think about
womb.
it,
Like, the symbol is like all of those things are real. So like when you start perceiving the world that way, it's um My family's going for a walk. I might have to bail quick. But when you start perceiving the world that way, it's like it truly is when it's just like Christ was the rock that was struck that gave water, or like Mary is the womb, is the world, is the ark. When you start seeing all these connections that gave birth to what is to the whole cosmos and to Christ, like it's all it really is. There's a way to say this, and this gets into my like monism, dualism, Trinitarianism. The Trinitarian thing is like those are all the same, and I mean that in the same way that like God is one. Those are one in the same way that God is one. That's not saying that they are equivalents. It's not saying that they are identical replications, but they share in the same homoousia. You know what I mean? They're like they're that's what a symbol is it's pointing to the sameness, the unity amidst multiplicity.
When one gets the idea that if the real meaning of the scriptures is something like incredibly symbolic like this, that when Jesus opened the minds of his disciples so that they could understand the way in which he was really prefigured,
Mm-hmm.
it was like by letting them understand this, like this profound symbolic language,
Yes.
rather than stuff like, well, remember in Isaiah when he said, like,
Yeah.
and then the number of characters here was 53, and then, well, I don't know, maybe it shades into that, but it's not like conventional apologetics.
No, that's
Because
very
when you look at the New Testament, man, it's like they're really crapping all over like Old Testament prophecy. Like it's not it's not exact at all. It's like very like shady and approximate and sort of like distorted. Like, what's going on here? This.
yeah, it's a well, and this is why within Orthodoxy John Bayer talks about this well, but his classic sermon that he preaches all the time or teaching is on how we know Christ, how Christ is revealed to us, how you see him as he is. And his point, the cliff notes, is that it was no different for like we assume that if we were there 2000 years ago, we'd have just seen Jesus walk around and been like, there goes the Son of God. And he's like, no, that's not how it would have worked. That's not how it worked for the disciples. It's not how it worked for Thomas. It was the way that they saw Christ for who he was. And this is clear even from an exegetical standpoint when you look at the text is Jesus appeared to them, the great. Well, it's interesting that like the resurrected Christ very often was not seen for who he was.
And then
And all of a
sometimes he
sudden,
just is.
yeah,
Like he fades in and out. It's like sometimes he's here, now he's not. It's like
right.
it's tricky because like his godness is sometimes concealed, and sometimes it's just like he just says, "Follow me," and it's like, "Oh yeah, okay."
Yeah, or they
It's like
don't,
it's weird, but
which is why all of reality, again, symbolically, is incarnation, is revelation, all of it. And so all of a sudden he's in the he's in the upper room and they're all hiding and he just appears. That's just what the text says. And then he opens the scriptures and shows them from the beginning the text concerning him. And then he breaks bread. So John Baer is just like, what are the two things? The opening of the scriptures and the breaking of the bread. And then their eyes are opened and they see him for who he is. It's not because, listen, post-enlightenment Christian rationalists, apologists who think like, oh, he's right there, they just see him with their eyes and they saw the historicity of the resurrection, they believed. That's not how it works. It's just not how it works. It didn't work that way for the disciples. Why is it going to work that way for you? It's about revelation. It's about having your eyes enlightened. It's about, if one of my favorite parts of the Bible is Matthew 7 after the Sermon on the Mount, when he's talking about if your eye is one, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, evil, divided, you could translate it any way you want. Divided. If your eye is unified, one, your whole body will be full of light. That's what I'm talking about. That's what iconic vision is. That's seeing the unity and multiplicity. That's symbolic vision. When you start to see the world that way, in a non-dual way that isn't like, because it really is that. It's not monism, it's not dualism, it's Trinitarianism. And I would argue that fundamentally we all perceive the world that way. We just don't think we do because we layer on these levels of egoic understanding that we think it that we tell ourselves is how we perceive the world, but it's not. We all perceive the world that way.
I think that you did a very good job of articulating sort of what is distinctive in the way that you see uh, spiritual things, the way that you approach scriptures, your particular version of Christianity, because we do all have our own versions.
Yeah.
I'm mindful that you have to get going, so I think this was a good note to end on. I think that it ended very well, ending on Christ as because he is the center. It
Yeah.
always does come back to Christ, and so I think that was great. I think that was I think this whole conversation, in my view, was very successful, very successful.
Nice. Well, thank you, and thank you for having me on. It's always I love talking to you, man. I'm glad that I mean, this seems like trite and platitude-y, but I'm glad, God brought us together because,
Yeah.
you know,
Well, we're different. We're different enough that there is something interesting that can happen. There's because it's all about the integration of differentiated parts, or iron sharpening iron, right?
for sure, man.
And because the weird thing about us is how differently we think. Not that differently, but really quite differently. It's all a matter of like resolution.
Yeah.
How different is different, and but but the way that we're converging on the same final truth, which is God as a conscious mind in whom we live and have our being, um, uh, a God who is what both immanent and transcendent, a God who is love, and sort of the inevitable ramifications of that idea, pointing toward a universal reconciliation. It's like we both saw that, but we saw it, we reached it by very different uh, routes.
Yeah.
And so that's really what I wanted to highlight in this episode. Like, a route to universalism is very different from mine, very interesting, and there's a lot of truth in it. It's just a lot of truth about contemporary Christianity that sort of manifested itself in this episode. So thank you so much.
Absolutely, man. It was a pleasure.